Hi, everyone. You are listening to Incorruptible Mass. This is where we talk about state politics, why our state government is so broken, how you can get involved to fix it, and all the things we could have here in Massachusetts if we did. So I am joined by Jonathan Cohn and Jordan Berg Powers. You want to introduce yourselves?
Yeah, my name's Jonathan Cohn. I'm a Boston-based activist who's been active with progressive issue and electoral campaigns for the past 8 years.
My name's Jordan Berg Powers. I use he, him, and I'm a Worcester activist. I've been working for 11 years in Massachusetts politics.
Anna Callahan, she, her, living in Medford. Been involved in it for a few years here in state politics. And today we are really going to talk about does our government work for? Really at all levels, right? The local government, state government, national government. And the idea that we talked about it as a progressive idea, but honestly, I think this is really just a people idea that our government should work for us and not for corporations and the uber wealthy. So, why do we pool our money at all? Why do we pay taxes and pool our money, right? Because without having a government, the rich would already win, right? The uber wealthy would step all over everybody and they would win. So that's not the purpose of pooling our money, right? We pool our money, first of all, so that we can have things like roads and, infrastructure and fire departments and all that kind of good stuff, but also to protect ourselves from awful things that happen, right? Like fires and earthquakes, even billionaires, right? So we want to be able to use our pooled money for us, for the people, for things that can be used by everybody, and to have a little bit of protection in a world that is unpredictable. Jordan, you have this amazing story about your experience with I believe it is the city of Worcester?
Yeah, so I have many experiences specifically with the Worcester Police. I have had nothing, I should say nothing. I have mostly bad experiences. I've actually had several very good experiences, but mostly bad experiences. And my favorite terrible experience is I went to complain to the city because they had put up signs saying that nobody could park on the street, and they had it up for over 3 months. So it was not clear what days people could park on the street, what days they couldn't. And I went to complain to the city to say, like, hey, is there a time frame for this? Because you can't just leave it up. People park on the street. We're a residential neighborhood in the middle of a city, and like people are confused. Sometimes they park, sometimes they don't, and it's really confusing. And they just said, nope, there's nothing you could do about it. We can enforce it any day we want. And it's because we're doing road improvements, but they weren't doing road improvements. We were just sitting there for 3 months. Nothing was changing on our street. Nothing was getting improved. Nothing was happening. They just had the signs up. And so after I complained, a few days later, the police came and ticketed every car on the street and told my neighbors that it was my fault that they were all getting tickets.
What?
And then when I came to the front door to complain about it, the police officer who was ticketing used the N-word and said, like, you shouldn't have complained, this is your fault. So then I complained a second time saying, like, hey, I'm being harassed by the police for complaining about this sign. And then a few weeks later, the city inspection services came to my house and ticketed me for having so-called rubbish and stuff on our house. And then when we went to remove it, ticketed us a second time because we put it in our driveway so that the people who come to pick up trash, right? And it wasn't a lot of trash. It was like a few leftover things that we were planning to, as people do when they're making improvements to their house, we were planning to get rid of. And they ticketed it a second time and came when the person was supposed to put in the driveway to get picked up. And they ticketed us for that. And then came a third time. And the only reason it stopped is because I threatened a lawsuit because he started looking at our windows while we were there, which is a violation of the law. So, and it was only through the threat of lawsuit that finally the harassment started. And I was thinking that this is strict, that the mechanisms of government, this big thing that's hard for regular people to feel like they can penetrate, was being used against me for the simple reason that I voiced my concerns about something or complained about something. Meanwhile, Tenet, who is the corporation who owns St. Vincent's Hospital. St. Vincent is a saint for administering to the poor. Catholic saint for administering to the poor. St. Vincent's is owned by a private corporation, one of the worst corporations in America. It has broken the law almost every year of its existence in the last 2 decades. It has had Medicare lawsuits. It has had defile with the federal agencies. It has broken the law. Worcester has done nothing to harass this large corporation. It's not going in there with food inspectors and encouraging them to say like, hey, what's going on with the food here? It's not enforcing all of the rules, which we know because it's a large corporation. It's breaking or doing smaller portions or doing smaller, it's cutting corners. It's finding ways to break the law to save money, right? It's not using the power of the state to go harass this large corporation, but it will use the power of the state to harass individual people. And all these politicians come through here, right? They're elected officials. They could use their power to make it clear that tenant refusing to be to work with the union to find a contract is unacceptable. Instead, they come, they make speeches, they give money for some food, but they never use their jobs to say, you know what, we're going to make your life a living hell, tenant, until you do the right thing and negotiate with the nurses who live and work in Worcester. If you are going to, and to be clear, tenant has also gotten tax breaks for buildings, so they've also gotten money, my money, from the city for them in this city. And so there is this imbalance that regular people see. And I think that's important to note, Anna, to your point, right? When people, the thing that connects progressives and conservatives is this idea that the government should work for us, and it doesn't.
Yeah, I'm going to jump in because I was recently canvassing for one of the Somerville at-large candidates. And as I was knocking on doors, out of the 7 people I talked to, 2 of them complained about almost exactly what you're talking about. 2 of them complained that one of them said that they had been trying for 8 or 9 months to get a permit to update their garage and that they couldn't get it. And they noticed, they said, you know what, when developers come in and, they want something and they get a permit right away, but me, a regular taxpayer, I cannot get a permit. And it's because there's all these forms, there's all this, bureaucracy and whatever. My favorite though was a conversation that I had with someone. He said he had only one issue. This guy's a plumber. And his only issue is that corporations are breaking the law. And he said this to me over and over. And he said he gets work when developers are doing things. So it's not that he doesn't want developers to build anything, because that's literally how he, gets jobs, that's how he gets his biggest jobs. But he said he sees every day himself and other homeowners who are trying to get permits. He himself was trying to get a permit for a year to just do something small on his own property, on his house that he owns. And yet across the street from him, there was a development that was like a commercial development. And he said they were breaking every law there was. They were breaking the law of how much space between the sidewalk and the building. They were breaking the law about the hours of the day that they were allowed to, to build and to be loud. They were, he just could list off all of these different laws that they were breaking. But the difference was they got permission from the city. So I think you're right. Regular people notice this thing and they know that it's happening.
2 stats I just want to bring in for this discussion of that imbalance. It was making me think, one thing it made me think of immediately was the issue of wage theft, right? Because we typically acknowledge that theft is wrong. Theft is illegal. It's also one of in different, let's say moral codes, you always end up saying, don't steal from other people. And if somebody shoplifts, if somebody take somebody else's wallet, we recognize that is a crime, and that's kind of a generally recognized that's something, and can often be punished overly harshly in the system as well. Especially, let's say shoplifting, which don't shoplift, but you can do immediate restitution for what you did there. Whereas, according to the Economic Policy Institute back in 2017, employers steal $15 billion a year from workers by paying less than the minimum wage. So And I've seen other stats at like countless levels, looking at like state statistics or local statistics, that wage theft is rampant, especially when you have like vulnerable populations as employees. And we see very minimal actual enforcement of wage laws compared. And that the other thing that reminded me of is a statistic. Getting this from an article from ProPublica from last year about how the IRS now audits poor Americans about the same rate as the top 1%.
Yeah, this article is amazing. I love this article. It really talks about how they've totally defunded the part of the IRS that investigates tax fraud from billionaires and mega millionaires, and that most of the IRS funding is spent investigating poor people.
Yeah, which is just absurd. And it's this absurd use of just like using the arm of like kind of using the state to just like bother, like to create unnecessary like administrative burden for people for where the investigation likely costs more money than the value that you could possibly gain back from it. Whereas when it comes to high scale tax fraud, that's where the money is. But they're just that.
And this is the obvious fingerprint of corruption. I mean, this is like, you can't get more obvious than this. Like, the people who have all the money are able to control the government of every level to make things super easy for them and super difficult for regular people.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two different ways I think about this. One is, I don't know if you remember a few years ago when the auditor and the then Obama state's attorney spent almost more money trying to investigate welfare fraud and EBT fraud as they recouped in EBT fraud, and they had cameras there, they had interagency like they had several agencies come forward to try to go after these poor people who were essentially going around the EBT system because it didn't work for them, right? They were in need of cash to pay for childcare, which is almost always paid in cash, in rent, which is almost paid in cash when you're poor. They were trying to work around the EBT system, and because they were trying to do so, the state came down on them, right, and tried to send people to jail, made a big deal about it. Look, we're going after welfare fraud. And they spent more money going after poor people than almost more money than they recouped from poor people. Meanwhile, I can't remember the last time somebody went after a large corporation to say, are you using that tax break the way you said you would? When was the last time that got enforced?
Yeah,
right? When was the last time the billions of dollars we give away in tax breaks was looked at? Hey.
When I was in urban planning graduate school, I one summer I did a research project, and it was looking at all these corporate tax breaks that cities did in the hopes that corporations would come into their cities and start jobs, and looking at the actual benefits that the cities thought they would get and that they got. And the whole thing is a race to the bottom, right? It does not end up with the benefits that people think there are. And I will say, at the State House, one of the things that people are trying to make happen is to have like a sunset provision, so that a couple of things, have a sunset provision so that when a law is passed that is a corporate tax break, that it is reviewed a few years later. It doesn't just go on indefinitely forever. And another one is to like look at what the purported benefits were supposed to be, and to see if they actually happened. Nobody ever does that. The corporations tell us that we're going to get more jobs, we're going to get a better economy, we're going to get these things, and then no one even bothers to look at whether those things actually happened, and yet the corporate benefits continue.
And so I'll just give two examples of that I'm thinking about. One is Unum Insurance in Worcester got a 15-year TIF to move basically a quarter of a mile, just a little bit down the road. It's
and ridiculous. A TIF is like a permission from
a TIF is a tax break from taxes in lieu, right? So it's a tax break. They didn't pay taxes on this new building, essentially paying for the building to move a quarter of a mile, and then they went digital, and they decided to close the office. right? So there's no more benefit to moving this thing. And in fairness to the city of Worcester, they are trying to recoup some of that money from it, but it's unclear how they can do so. And again, the state legislature could be giving more avenues for the municipalities to recoup money in TIFs to actually look at these things, but they don't. Of course, they don't look at any of these things. I'll give another one that's just example from what I see on a ground on a regular basis. So I was on the Conservation Commission in Worcester for I think 7 years, I think maybe 8 years, somewhere in there, and I then moved on to the zoning board in Worcester, which so I see a lot of these things. I am in those roles the power of the government. I am a big part of overseeing government oversight, and one of the things I see all the time is that if a regular person comes in, we treat them like they have endless pockets, and we make them make them tick every single box to get through our process. You want to build a deck on your yard, you better have a climate, you better have a wetland scientist come in, which costs a ton of money. You better have staking, you better do all these things, and everybody there talks about it like that's a normal thing for the government to require people to go above and beyond what they clearly have money for to do really simple things. Meanwhile, a big corporation comes in, or a big developer 9 times out of 10, and they'll say, look, we got to move this forward. It's costing us, we put in $20 million, we put in $100 million. And people on the board start to get nervous. They're like, oh, I can't cost this city money, right? So they immediately fold. Now, all of a sudden, all of those rules, which were so critical, and they're onerous, right? For regular people, they are onerous. They are just, now all of a sudden those rules go out the window, because people with money start saying things like, oh, well, I don't know if I can afford that. I don't know if I could do it. This is such a big project. I'm just like, I regularly say on those boards that I don't care that you put $1 million into it. That means you have $1 million to spend on this thing. You better do it right.
And
but we just have we frame it the opposite.
If they put $1 million in, that's because they expect way more than that out of it.
Exactly.
Unlike your regular person who is working on their house.
So we recently had somebody wanting to put a deck in their yard, and we made them go through all these rigmaroles. And finally, I was just like, "This is a deck in your yard. You own this property, and you want to put a deck there? Why is this before me? Like this is onerous." And I just said that. I was like, "This is onerous. This is crazy." No more 20 minutes later, there was a multi-million-dollar redevelopment which flew through which is like just nothing. Like it was like nothing happened. And it's just, again, it's like it's this thing, and regular people see that, right? Like regular people, they feel that that's the way they interact with government. They feel that, and that's just backwards.
Are you telling me that if the average people in Worcester don't have high-powered real estate lawyers on retainer?
They almost do, because there's one guy who comes in and does all of their things. But I assume he's charging the same. So, I mean, it's totally a racket. There's just, because again, it's a specialized field, right? Like getting through the Conservation Commission, getting through the zoning board is a specialized field that costs money.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's really difficult.
I love the thing that you, Jordan, said near the beginning about how if our government was working for us, they would be, should we use the term harassing? They would be on Tenet's case for all the laws they're breaking.
Yeah.
Not only are they not on their case, but look at the ways in which our city governments, state governments, federal governments bend over backwards to give money, to not even require the regulations that we require for regular people for these giant corporations. And I would love for us to ping around, what would our state government especially be doing if it were there to defend regular people and to hold corporations accountable?
I mean, the first thing for me is it would put money behind enforcement of these things. Because a lot of, one of the things you realize if you sort of work on policy, but live in the world, is that the gap between a written policy, a law, and its enforcement, like those two will never meet. They're just so wide. And that's especially true when it comes to protecting regular people. So the way to enforce that regular people protection is to actually hold those large corporations accountable on our behalf. And that requires money both to hire better lawyers and also money to look into it, right? To do the enforcement side of it. And none of the money is in enforcement. We put billions of dollars into regulating people's personal drug use and pennies into corporations' illegality.
Yeah.
It reminds me, though, like, when it comes to, say, like enforcement, that like the on the books laws in Massachusetts around employee misclassification are much stronger than those of other states. It's just like anything that like needs to be enforced a lot better, because we all know how kind of widespread misclassification is. Shout out Uber and Lyft. But who are rumored to even be doing a ballot question to try to undermine the existing laws that we have around that. But they're not, but the fact that we don't hear constantly about them being under a kind of being investigated is that it's just not enforced in as strongly as it should be.
Yeah, there's no, one of the things I've been joking around, but I'm actually now serious about calling for is, I think every time, your landlord illegally says you have to leave or raises your rent, you should call the police. And every time somebody steals your wages, you should call the police. Because let's start being ridiculous about it. Let's start enforcing the rules that they're on there. I'll just, again, to another really quick example. We Santander Bank, we sued, my wife and I we were the lead plaintiffs in a class action lawsuit, which cost Santander Bank $32 million, which is something I'm very proud of. And part of that, the part that never got resolved is the city. It's illegal in Massachusetts, again, talking about protections, it's illegal in the city, in the state, for tow trucks to come onto private property to take private property, right? You can't come onto private property to take private property. And this is especially true when you own more of the car than is thing, which is a whole other piece to that. That's why Santander lost this lawsuit. And I went down to the police station with the law, the literal black and white, like the case law that was written that said that you can't do this. And they just said, we don't care. We're not going to enforce it. We don't care. They just ignored me. It's crazy. So,
it is crazy. You were talking about landlords, and one thing that I think about a lot is the amount of power that landlords have, just informational power, and the lack of power that tenants have. And so, tenants, if you're a landlord, you can do credit checks on your tenants, you do background checks on your tenants, you can do criminal, you can do anything you want. And yet tenants have no ability whatsoever to do any kind of check on their landlords, in part because we don't even require landlords to be registered anywhere. There's no sort of body where you can make an official complaint against your landlord, and that will stay with them in some place that future tenants can find that information. Like, we just have the power dynamics of purely of information between tenants and landlords. Like, I've had landlords where I later found out from prior tenants what a totally effed up, dude and from the next door neighbor, putting cameras and videoing tenants. Super, super creepy stuff. And yet there is nowhere that information has been gathered, except for you just happen to talk to your neighbor, you happen to find some, ex-tenant of the same person and hear the same stories. That needs to be recorded somewhere. And yet, from the perspective of our city and state governments, landlords don't even have to be registered anywhere.
Yeah, I'll just go one more example, and then I think we should go to Jonathan. Is there was a whole, I don't know if we all remember, but there was people who got their houses stolen. Like, I also think about how much control banks have over me I'm a landlord, technically. I own my house. I have 3 levels. They literally illegally signed. They had robo-signing of things. They were illegally signing and taking people's homes, and no one went to jail for that.
Right.
But if you were to if I, as a person, were to forge a document, which is what they were doing, I would go to jail. I would lose my house, right? Like, there'd be consequences. But banks doing it in mass, costing millions of Americans their homes. And in Massachusetts, Nothing happened. There was no repercussions. Our attorney general didn't bring anybody to court on it. We signed a really generous get out of jail free settlement with the banks, essentially. And people are getting foreclosed on today. Like, they're just having their homes taken away.
But the same people, same banks.
And the legislature just passed like a pretty weak foreclosure bill in response to that. I can't remember. I wasn't following.
It was, not only was it weak, it made it easier to foreclose.
This is what we're talking about.
It reminds me of how I've often talked about the forward motion in the Massachusetts legislature is them doing less things that are like actively harmful and instead doing things that are woefully insufficient.
Bravo.
So that is actually real forward motion. The point about that with the foreclosure crisis just reminded me of the time years ago when I actually had moved my money out of Wells Fargo, and part because it was and part driven because of moving and not being near one, and part also because, as I had commented at the time, if I put my money in a hole in the ground, at least the hole in the ground wouldn't falsely foreclose on people.
That's right.
And it's wild about how little accountability there was for anybody involved in that. But the other point that I want to make up in terms of like thinking of the ways that cities and states bend laws in favor of large corporations made me think of the Olympics. Since, as popping back in the news again and thinking back to Boston's long since aborted bid for the 2024 Summer Olympics, and having been active kind of organizing against it at the time, it was rather striking when you see about how much like the host cities for the Olympics bend all the forms of city government in service of the Olympics, whether it's your housing policy, your zoning laws, you're creating like a designated lane for those on the IOC out, like basically causing traffic to worsen for everybody else. The fact that the Olympics actually would get designated space on all city and state owned billboards. So you're just like handing over like massive like property that like strong bits of trademark kind of trademark protections, as well as the financial guarantee that a host city would have to say, saying if your costs run over, don't worry, we got you covered. We will pay out of our own public coffers for any of the cost overruns. And it also I was thinking of this earlier about how Worcester's had, like, thankfully Boston was protected from this, although we still have issues on this front. But what it reminded me of the stadium in Worcester, which was just like a massive giveaway of tax dollars.
Yeah, I mean, it's so Worcester, for people who don't know, has the most expensive stadium in the minor league stadium in the country. The people who own the Worcester Red Sox are one of the richest corporations that own businesses. They're one of the largest business owners of sports in the world. So think about that. They own a minor league team. They're one of the richest. And they had basically the city give them an absolute free stadium. And you contrast that with some of the other large, most of the really, really big sports franchises are all soccer or football, right? Soccer, football. In Europe, those big corporations, and they are forced by their countries to build their own stadiums. And they're, in a lot of ways, we think of these things as really large corporations, all these things, right? But a lot of these soccer teams are in small towns or small parts of London, right? They are no different than Worcester in terms of size, but they are demanding that their teams build their own stadiums. But we're giving away, we gave away prime real estate that could have gone to something that people, to be clear, in the community had designed. A canal, other things that they wanted there, that the city was like, no, we're not gonna do that. People who live there were like, we have these ideas that the government could spend money to own this thing that then would benefit the city. And the city was like, no, what we're gonna do is build the most expensive minor league stadium that ends up being totally ugly in the country, and give it to this already extraordinarily extractive sports group, right? They pay their players poorly. They have enormous amount of wealth. We're gonna give them this free stadium and a bunch of tax breaks. It is just amazing to think about. Like it's hard to fathom a better example of how government really works just for rich people than the people who living there, the businesses, all the folks saying we want this thing, and the government going, we're just going to help this one person, these one group of people with a lot of money.
The ones who already have the money, that's who we're going to be helping.
Yeah.
So we're gonna close this up. We I think we're talking about something that most people can feel deeply. Already we see it in our everyday lives, and it's why we need we got to change things. We got to change the way that we do politics. And as we were talking about before, a different way of engaging with our elected officials. So we're excited about that. Next week, we are going to be talking about climate change. And I'm excited about that too. Horrified by climate change, of course. One final thing, we mentioned Tenet, but we didn't really give a shout out to the nurses, the 800 nurses who have been on strike for how many weeks now?
I think it's 3 months.
It is
maybe longer.
Really incredible.
I just want to say really quickly that I think that the reason progressives need to care about this is progressives should care about government working. It's one of the things that makes us who we are. And we are different from liberals, and that liberals just sort of they just think government should sort of like do a little bit of things. It doesn't really matter how big it is or what it does. It's just sort of like fix so that the plebites don't get out of control, like just sort of broad things. And progressivism understands that government can also be onerous, and so therefore we should be interested in making sure it works for everyone. So I just think that there's a really important piece to that I'm really glad that we surfaced in this conversation, to say like progressives care about government. We care about it working right. We care about it working for people. It's important. It's an important part of our ethos.
We shouldn't put up with it just not doing awful things, Jonathan, as you were saying. We should expect and insist that it works for us in big sweeping changes to do the things that we need.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Always a pleasure. See y'all next week.